This time I'm going to demonstrate a little bit of inking, and then I'm going to use a variety of tools. This is a Hunt 102 crowquill. I used to use this quite a bit. I tend to use a Micron PN, which means plastic nib. I'll demonstrate that. I have a variety of Micron pens. This is a sable brush. Let's see, Kalinsky, this is a Raphael 8403. It's a number 2. Holds a nice point. I will be using, this is, I think, regular Higgins Indian ink. This is a ceramic base that I made to prevent tipping over. It's got an eyedropper. It doesn't actually work. I still made some messes with this ceramic base. Also, I use a little bit of water on hand. This is actually a bird's eye milkshake concentrate container from the 1970s. I've actually used this in almost every single comic book I've produced in the past 40 years. I use this as a container full of water. Use a little bit of whiteout, usually Bleed-Proof White, Luma. There used to be a brand called Stig's White and other brands. It's kind of a concentrated white watercolor. You want to kind of keep it fresh. I will use a little bit of spray water just to keep things moist. I'll squirt a little bit in that jar. Demonstrate that. One thing I stay away from in ink drawing is Sharpie markers and felt tip pens. I think I have a flare pen in here somewhere. Not that they are bad. I obviously own a Sharpie marker, but they're not color fast. And if you've been around as long as I have, you've done written a note or written on a cardboard box and leave it out in the sunshine, you'll notice that these Sharpies will fade in the light. Maybe not immediately. They're also kind of fuzzy when they hit the paper. So I avoid that for ink drawing. I prefer Indian ink whenever possible, or pigment markers. This is a Bioke pen, and it's kind of a brush tip. It's refillable, and I've been using this more and more for especially for autographs. When I do my autograph, it works really nicely. I used to be able to do that with a brush, a little harder to control. And you can see I have a little piece of, this is the end of a pad of paper. I keep this just to test my pen points and my brushes. So here's my bottle of ink. Try to keep the ink bottle fairly full. Drawing with a brush is a little bit tricky, just because you can barely feel the tip of the brush on the paper. I use the same wrist motion. I tend to draw with my wrist. The fingers just kind of hold the brush rather relaxed. This is called feathering, where you just repeat the same line move your arm just a slight bit to get a nice texture. The ability to create different textures with pen and ink is the real secret to the lively ink drawing. But practice. What you don't want to do, it's easy enough to make this kind of mistake, but you kind of squish, if you kind of squish your pen or your brush in the wrong direction, you get kind of an ugly mark. You might want that every once in a while, but generally you want to kind of have a smooth, tapered line. Kind of gets thick and then it kind of tapers off and gets thin. Now, you'll hear the word feathering, and to my way of thinking, feathering is, this is feathering, which some people would call, they would call that hatching, and then they would call this cross hatching when you cross the lines. I call this feathering because it looks like a feather. This kind of a design. I've also heard the word feathering used just to describe that thick and thin line, a line that tapers off. Personally, I think that's incorrect. I think feathering is when you do a bunch of lines in the same direction, creating texture. And you'll notice I have like one side of the line is heavy and black, and it kind of feathers off into a series of lines to emulate shading. Mort Drucker and Neil Adams used to do this kind of texture where they would have not just cross hatching, but they'd have like kind of multiple multiple lines or multiple directions. I used to do a lot of this in old Megaton Man, real fine, kind of muscular shading. It's easy to kind of get carried away with this. And even more so with a crowquill. Hear the kind of, maybe you can hear the scratching here. And you can see there's little bits of white area left. Takes a little delicate touch to get the ink to flow. I like dip pens and brushes because it gives you a little time to think about what you're doing while you're reloading your drawing implement. I used to go nuts on, especially on the spacesuits in Border Worlds. There would be lots of texture, little flecks and little hatches. The master of this, of course, is Jean Giraud, Mobius. the great French cartoonist, science fiction cartoonist, who do all kinds of textures. This is kind of based on etching technique, where you're actually scratching into a metal plate. It kind of derives from early reproduction printing techniques, printing plates. We emulate that in pen and ink, and you can do it with crowquill. You can do it with the Micron PN. It's a nice tool to get little textures and so forth. You'll notice, particularly with the crowquill pen, you can hold it right up at the tip and have certain control that way. One of the things I've discovered in recent years is I can hold the pen or the pen handle a little further back and get kind of a sweeping arc. It's a little harder to do with the brush, but the same principle applies. You can kind of get a smooth arc with the brush or with any drawing tool, as I showed with pencil in another video. You want to be able to kind of repeat the motion. It's important to have the ability to produce lines that are parallel, running in the same direction, and all you have to do is kind of move slightly to create textures. If you can go over a line and go in the same direction, it's a very useful technique. If you're using your fingers, by the way, if you're using your fingers like this, it's a little harder to control the line, as I showed with pencil. It's a little harder to show the directions or to control the direction that you're inking in. I tend to go from side to side. I tend to use my wrist in such a way like that. So those are some of the textures that you can achieve with the different tools. What I'm showing you now is an old sketchbook page, and this is a draftsman's duster. Use that after you do your erasing to kind of clear off the debris from your erasings. I've begun to draw Ms. Megaton Man on the left, and I've drawn Megaton Man on the right, and I've used blue pencil to start with. Focusing my camera, sorry about that. Whether you choose to pencil very tightly or loosely is up to you. I started out penciling very loose in the old days, especially Megaton Man, and leaving something. You want to leave something to the inking. You don't want the inking just to be mindless tracing. You want to have enough structure in your pencils to know what your image is going to be. But you don't want such tight penciling that there's nothing left to do in the inking stage. want to have a little feathering. I usually leave the feathering to the inking stage. I always turn the paper around so that it's the most comfortable angle when I'm moving my wrist. I try to have lines going in the same direction, kind of smooth. And I'm using a brush right now, which gives you the ability to put in a thick black line. I used to draw these triangles. You may not know this. A lot of people don't know this, but Ms. Megaton Man and Megaton Man both have M's on their chest. And these little triangles that seem to come out of their panties are these negative spaces of the M. I used to just blacken them all in. Now what I do is I kind of put in some lines, kind of have them black at the top of the triangle, and then I kind of have them taper off into white. And you can go one direction or the other. You can start with the black and go to the white, and you start the white and go to the black. Again, I'm using all brush here, which is a little harder to control. For some reason, when I'm inking the curves of breasts, that's where I'm most likely to choke. I'm sure that's a Freudian problem, some deep-seated Freudian. I once had a female student, drawing student, ask me how to draw breasts, which is a story that I won't get into right now. Anyway, now, if I'm using a fine line, or if I need a fine line in my drawing, there's really no need to use a brush. You could use a brush, but I tend to use my Micron pigment plastic nib PN. It's just a little easier to control. You're not having to fight the tool. Also for like circles, like these buttons, tight little circles, tight little curves. The Micron or even the crowquill pen is just a little easier to control. I used to do everything with the brush back in the early 80s. Everything that I drew. Sorry, the focus is just a little soft there. And the problem with that, as I say, it's really very demanding to get in there and do detail with the brush and to do tight little curves. And sometimes it makes more sense to use a fine line, little harder nosed drawing tool. Now you will make mistakes with ink, and a lot of people, myself included, can get a little bit of stage fright when it comes to ink. We think of ink as permanent. We sign contracts in ink, and we think ink is indelible. And so we have a tendency to be a little frightful and a little and maybe even a little because we're so fearful, we tend to make more mistakes. The way to overcome that is practice, number one. Here I'm doing a reverse curve. I'm moving my paper around, as I've shown in the video. You should find the curve that's relaxed, that flows with your wrist, your natural movement. And you can see I'm still kind of I'm still drawing. I'm still shaping the lines a little bit. I've still left something to the ink part of the process to make it inking is kind of mindless, because you've worked out most of your problems with the pencil, and because you've worked out the drawing with the pencil, your brain can go to sleep while you're inking. It can be very boring. So you want to leave a little bit. I like to leave a little bit of the shading, a little bit of the artistic choices to the inking stage. I used to pencil very loosely and leave a lot of the problem solving to the ink stage, which to me is a little bit reckless now, right? I think you tend to pencil a little bit more tightly. Trying to focus the camera. And it seems to especially work on Megaton Man, because this is a pretty complete drawing here. It's in blue pencil. Here I've tightened it up with graphite over on this side. But in the old days, my penciling looked a little more like this, and maybe it was even a bit rougher than this. And then I would just ink the heck out of it. Ink the hell out of it, really. And go bonkers with the detail. And that seemed to work really well. People like that overworked quality of those early Megaton Man and Ms. I think it was kind of neurotic, but because it could get pretty obsessive, kind of the Neil Adams Mort Drucker thing that I was showing you before, only just never knowing when to quit, just adding feathering upon feathering. And of course, Border Worlds was a very obsessive texture, kind of inking on the spacesuits and so forth. But I like to leave something to the inking. I like to leave a few of the details out of the pencil drawing. I don't like to pencil so tightly that it's a completely finished drawing that I'm just tracing over. Because when that happens, the result can be rather lifeless. If all you're doing is mimicking the pencil lines, when the pencil lines are so tight and so finished, there's nothing left to really add. And there's nowhere to go but down. It's kind of, you can deaden the drawing. As I say, this is more of the old school of inking for me. You can still add details in the pencils even after you've started inking. You can sometimes I go back and I tighten up the pencils a little bit, add some details if things are a little too fuzzy. I'm using blue pencil here. I could use the, maybe you can hear my electric pencil sharpener, using a little graphite pencil here. So sometimes I'll do a pass of inking and then I'll go back, and this is a rather recent phenomenon, that I'll actually go back and I'll maybe outline my figures. Then I'll go back in and pencil, and I'll add some more shading, and then I'll go in with the brush That's more the way they did it in the old school Milton Caniff days. They would outline the drawings with a crowquill or something like this. This Micron pen that I'm using. It's coming out. One thing about the Microns that I don't like is they do tend to dry out. And you're throwing away a big chunk of plastic. But one other point I want to make while I'm doing this demo is that stage fright that I was talking about with ink, the fear of making mistakes, it will go away, particularly if you learn how to make corrections. And so the ability to make corrections is a really important part of the game. I mentioned Bleed-Proof White, Luma, different brands. It's basically a kind of concentrated watercolor. There's liquid paper, which is more of a permanent kind of plastic medium. I have a brush dedicated. This is just an old brush that I used to ink with, and I use it for my whiteout now. It's all dried and hardened, so you have to wet it. But a little bit of white paint works wonders on your ink drawings. So if you have a little speck where you don't want a little speck, or if lines are too thick, and you can make a correction, a deft correction, so that it looks nice and clean, like that's the way that you originally intended it. Once you learn to make corrections, then you will relax, and you will not be so fearful of ink. And the result will be you'll actually be more relaxed, and you'll probably make less mistakes that you'll need to correct once you learn how to make corrections. So that's my demo for today. A little bit of inking technique on Megaton Man and Ms. Megaton Man, and try these tools. Try what works for you. Try to apply it to your own game, and thanks for watching.